The last thing Wesley Cartwright remembered was the smell of burnt sugar and gas. He'd been pulling a tray of egg tarts from the big deck oven at the bakery on 5th, humming along under his breath to whatever was playing on the kitchen radio, the way he did every single morning shift for 6 years running. Then the old gas line behind the ovens, the one he'd told his manager about twice that month, finally gave out. There was a hiss, one heartbeat of silence, and then heat and noise so total that his mind went white, then black, before the pain even had time to catch up with him. He supposed that was one way to go. Quick at least, doing something he loved at least. He did not expect to open his eyes again. He certainly did not expect to open them as someone else. The first thing he noticed was the ceiling. Carved wood, high and arched, crisscrossed with old dark beams, nothing at all like the water-stained popcorn ceiling of his studio apartment. The second thing he noticed was his own hands, when he lifted them to his face on reflex. They were pale and slender, long-fingered, unscarred. Nothing like the calloused, burn-marked hands he'd spent a decade building over a hot line. The third thing he noticed was a name, rising up out of nowhere the instant he thought, "Where am I?" It didn't arrive like a memory of his own. It arrived gently, almost politely, the way someone might set a cup down in front of you without being asked. Wesley Ashgrove, second son of Viscount Ashgrove, Omega, 18 years old. He lay still a long moment, letting the borrowed memories settle the way flour dust settles after a hard need, slow and a little at a time. There was a noble household in them, a kingdom built on courts and titles and old family names, an entire tangled social order of alphas and omegas, of scent bonds and mating ceremonies, that until an hour ago he had only read about in a paperback his co-worker Priya had shoved into his hands during a slow Tuesday shift. "You have to read this," she'd said, grinning around her iced coffee. "There's literally a character named Wesley in it. Isn't that wild?" He'd gotten through 3 chapters on his lunch break, mostly to be polite. He remembered thinking the male-leds crowd of alpha suitors was a bit much, and that the older Ashgrove brother, the Omega everyone in the story adored, the one the whole plot seemed to orbit, was a little insufferable. Gorgeous, yes. Beloved, yes. But always chasing some new handsome face. Never once sitting still long enough to notice the people already standing right next to him. And now here Wesley was, lying inside that very story, wearing the skin of the character nobody in it had ever cared about. The forgettable second son. The one who, if he remembered the plot correctly, and a cold weight was already settling low in his stomach as more memories rose to the surface, was about to ruin his own life at his older brother's bonding ceremony. His brother, Julian, was going to choose a mate from 5 waiting alpha candidates in front of the entire capital, and this Wesley, the original Wesley, was going to make a scene of it. Weep, beg, confess some hopeless, humiliating feeling for one of the candidates in front of the whole watching court, disgracing the family so badly that he'd be shipped off to some distant estate and quietly written out of the story for good. That day, Wesley realized, without needing the memories to spell it out twice, was 10 weeks away. He sat up slowly and caught his reflection in a small mirror across the room. A stranger looked back, and yet not quite a stranger. Soft, dark blonde hair, the color of wheat just before harvest, fell loose over a pale forehead. His eyes were warm brown, the color of steeped tea, nothing like the sharp, storybook features he might have expected of a noble house. Later, once the borrowed memories filled in the gaps properly, he'd learned the coloring came from his mother's side. While Julian had inherited their father's light brown hair and startling blue eyes, the kind of blue people in this world simply called true Ashgrove blue. Wesley's own coloring marked him as different the moment anyone looked at him. The quiet, warm-toned shadow standing next to his brother's golden brilliance. He closed his eyes. "I'm sorry," he thought, to whatever remained of the boy whose body this had once solely belonged to, whose grief and loneliness still hummed faintly beneath his own skin like an old bruise that hadn't quite healed. "I don't know if you can still hear me, but I'm not going anywhere, and neither are you. Not really. I just think we deserve better than a lifetime of being an afterthought." He didn't know if the original soul was still tucked somewhere in there, listening. Either way, he made the promise into the quiet of the room like it was a vow that mattered. "I'll live a life you don't have to be ashamed of, loud enough that nobody gets to overlook you again." There was one more thing tangled up in the borrowed memories, small and strange among all the noble names and old family grudges, a craving, a very specific, very stubborn craving for something this whole glittering kingdom simply didn't seem to have. Every noble parlor in 18 years of memory smelled of black tea and clipped hedges and old coin. Not one of them smelled like coffee. Wesley missed it the way you miss an old friend you didn't even know you'd lost, until the ache showed up out of absolutely nowhere. He opened his eyes, took one long breath, and started making a plan the way he always had, the way he'd built every good thing in his old life. One clear decision at a time. He was going to open a bakery. It took him 4 days to work up the nerve to speak to his father. Not because he was afraid, the old reflex that used to live in this body, the flinching, the folding in on himself, he simply set aside the way a baker sets aside a burnt batch and starts fresh. He waited 4 days because he wanted his numbers solid first. 386 gold coins, 720 silver, a decade of birthday money and small, unremarkable gifts nobody had ever noticed him quietly saving, because nobody had ever paid close enough attention to notice him at all. It wasn't a fortune. It was enough to rent a modest storefront and keep it running a few months if he was careful. Not enough to survive the real growing pains of a business. He'd need more. He'd need help. But first, he needed to stop needing permission. He found his father in the study after supper, half buried in ledgers, glancing up with the mild, worn-out irritation of a man who had long since stopped expecting anything interesting out of his second son. Father. Wesley didn't sit, didn't wring his hands. He looked his father dead in the eye, something the original boy had never quite managed, and said, "I'm opening a business, a bakery. I'm not asking your permission, I'm informing you, since I still live under this roof. It won't carry the Ashgrove name. I've had papers drawn up stating the family has no claim over it, and that any profit belongs to me alone." He set the papers on the desk. His father blinked at him. Then, slowly, a smirk crossed his face. The smirk of a man who'd decided his quiet, easily overlooked son had found a harmless little hobby to occupy himself before the bonding season embarrassed the family properly. Better a bakery than another scandal, his expression seemed to say. "Play at your little shop, then," he said, already reaching for his pen, not bothering to read past the first line. "I suppose it will do you good to feel useful." He signed without a second thought. Wesley took the papers, thanked him with perfect calm, and walked out of the study, feeling something settle into place in his chest for the first time since waking in this life. Not quite triumph. Closer to the quiet, satisfied feeling of an oven finally reaching the right temperature after a long, patient morning of waiting. He thinks I'm weak, Wesley thought, folding the papers into his coat. Let him keep thinking that for exactly as long as it's useful to me. His next stop was his aunt's townhouse, on the merchant side of the capital, where the street smelled of horses and cardamom and old coin instead of hedges and old blood. Aunt Vivienne was his mother's younger sister, widowed young, now running the family's trading house with a sharp mind that had made her more gold in 5 years than her late husband had made in 20. She received him with surprise, and then real delight once he laid out the plan. "A bakery," she repeated, turning the word over like she was checking a coin for a counterfeit ring. "You're serious?" "I am." He'd rehearsed this part. "I know my own funds aren't enough, and I won't ask my parents for more. Anything I take from them ends up serving Julian somehow, even by accident. But I know the shape of this business, Aunt Vivienne. I know it in my bones in a way I don't know anything else in this world. I'm asking you to invest. I'm offering 20% of the yearly profit." For a moment she only looked at him, not the way his parents looked at him, through him, past him, toward his brother's shadow. She looked at him, really looked, maybe for the first time. "I don't want your money's worth back, Wesley," she said quietly. "I'd help you for nothing but the pleasure of watching you want something for once. I know, that's exactly why I want you to take the 20%. He held her eyes. "I don't want charity holding this shop up. I want a partner, something that has to stand on its own, because if it fails, it's my failure, not a kindness wasted." She laughed, startled and pleased all at once, and reached over to squeeze his hand. "You've grown a spine somewhere in the last week, little owl." If only she knew, he thought, and smiled back. The first easy, unguarded smile this body had worn in a very long time. Building a bakery from nothing, twice, in 2 different lives, had taught Wesley the same lesson both times. The plan mattered less than the ingredients, and the ingredients mattered less than knowing exactly who you were feeding. Refined cane sugar in this kingdom was a luxury, shipped in from the southern trade routes and taxed until it cost nearly as much as gold. That was a problem for a shop that wanted commoners walking through its door as easily as nobles. So Wesley went looking for a cheaper way, the way he used to hunt for a substitute when a supplier ran late back on 5th Street, and found, through his aunt's trade contacts, farmers in the outer districts growing pale, unremarkable root vegetables nobody thought to use for much beyond soup, sugar beets. He nearly laughed out loud the first time he saw them piled dusty and unloved in a market cart. His old kitchen knowledge sat inside this new body like a second set of hands, and within 2 weeks he had a small, strange-smelling, very promising batch of beet syrup bubbling away in a borrowed kitchen. He grew his own yeast starter from grape skins and rye flour, tended the same slow way his grandmother back home used to keep a sourdough crock alive for years. He turned bruised, unsellable apricots into glossy jam nobody would ever guess had come out of a discard bin. He wrote to his grandmother in the Southern Territories, half joking and half hopeful, describing a certain orange root vegetable and a certain bitter dark chocolate he remembered fondly from another life. 3 weeks later, a crate arrived from her estate with exactly what he'd asked for: carrots and a small sack of raw cacao nibs that made him laugh out loud with relief right there in the storeroom. He did not ask her for coffee. He almost did, pen hovering over the paper before he set it back down. Coffee was his. Quietly, privately his. The one thing from his old life he wasn't ready to hand over to a kingdom that had never once tasted it. He wanted to keep at least one small piece of his old world tucked away where nobody could turn it into a fashion or a tax. Carrot cake and dark chocolate brownie bars went on the menu that same week. He designed the shop in his head 100 times before he ever touched a wall. A front counter for the everyday, jam buns, honey twists, plain sweet milk rolls cheap enough for a laborer's coin purse, but good enough that passing nobles found themselves buying 3 at a time anyway. A glass case further back for the finer work. Brown butter honey cakes, cream puffs so light they seemed to float, cinnamon rolls twisted like little church spires, and whole apple pies that filled the shop with a smell like autumn itself. He rented a modest storefront on a street sitting exactly between the merchant quarter and the edge of the noble district, close enough for carriages, humble enough that commoners never felt unwelcome walking in. He took the small room above it as his own home, and for the first time since waking in this body, he slept in a bed too small and slightly lumpy and entirely, gloriously his own. He named the shop nothing grand, just Hearth and Honey in plain gold letters over the door, a name that belonged to no one's family, chosen and claimed entirely on his own terms. He hired 2 kitchen hands his first week, a cheerful former farmhand named Ben, who turned out to have a real gift for folding dough, and a sharp-eyed girl named Sadie, who could price a tray of pastries by eye faster than Wesley could do the sums on paper. Neither had a drop of noble blood. Wesley paid them fairly and let them taste every new recipe before it reached the counter, because he remembered exactly what it felt like to be talented and invisible in a kitchen that never once asked his opinion. Before any of that, though, there was the matter of the ovens themselves. The first mason he hired built the brick oven exactly the way the local guild had always built them, tall, narrow, hard to regulate, and Wesley spent 3 frustrating days arguing, in the politest terms a former line cook could manage, that he needed something wider and lower, with a proper flue he could adjust by feel. The mason had looked at him like he'd asked for the moon. "No shop in this city bakes that way," the man said. "Then this shop will be the first," Wesley told him, and paid the man double to rebuild it his way. It took an extra week, and very nearly every spare coin he had, but the first time he slid a tray of jam buns into that oven, and felt the heat settle even and steady across every inch of the rack, he understood it had been worth every silver piece. He also spent those early weeks quietly relearning his own hands. The body was young and unscarred, and had never once needed a proper dough, and for the first several batches his instincts outran his fingers. He knew exactly what the dough should feel like at the right hydration, exactly how it should spring back under a knuckle, but his palms were soft and slow to obey him, blistering twice before they toughened. Sadie found him icing his hands in a bucket of cold water after a long night and asked, not unkindly, why a noble's son had calluses coming in like a baker's apprentice. Old habits was all he said, and she'd let it go, the way she let go of most things that weren't her business. filing it away instead as one more small oddity about her strange new employer that she'd decided, on the whole, she rather liked. He opened on a cold, bright morning to a small crowd of curious neighbors and sold out by mid-afternoon. One of those first customers came back the very next day and the day after that. His name was Miles Hartley, the easygoing younger son of a minor baron, with a mop of sandy hair and a laugh that carried across the whole shop. He'd wandered in on opening day, looking for something to bring his sister, and left instead with an armful of honey twists. And though neither of them knew it yet, the beginning of a habit that would follow him for years. "You," Miles announced on his third visit, leaning both elbows on the counter like he owned it, "are going to make me fat and poor, and I've decided I don't mind at all." "That's bad for business," Wesley said, sliding a warm roll across to him anyway. "I need you rich enough to keep coming back. Then I'll simply love you from a modest but sustainable distance," Miles said cheerfully, and Wesley laughed, not thinking much of it at the time. It was an easy kind of friendship, the sort Wesley had never had time for back home, and he found he genuinely liked having it. Miles was quick with a joke, quicker to help carry a crate of flour without being asked, and utterly unbothered by rank or reputation. He simply liked Wesley, plainly and honestly, the same way he liked good bread and bad puns. Neither of them knew yet how much that plain liking would grow, or how much it would eventually cost Miles to keep quietly to himself. Word of the shop moved fast. Within 2 weeks, carriages bearing crests Wesley, recognized from his old skim of the novel, had begun stopping outside, dropping off noble ladies and their maids, who left clutching paper boxes like trophies. He kept the daily amount small on purpose. Scarcity was its own kind of advertising, and besides, with 2 hired hands and his own 2 tired arms, he genuinely couldn't make more. His family noticed, of course. His father's smirk from that first evening slowly curdled into something more calculating as word of a fashionable little bakery, run by some Ashgrove boy, began moving through the drawing rooms his parents actually cared about. Wesley didn't care. He was too busy proofing dough at 4 in the morning, humming a song from a radio that no longer existed, happier than he could remember being in either of his lives. The weeks leading up to the ceremony had been, by the standards of the noble half of Wesley's new family, a small circus. Invitations arrived daily. Tailors came and went from the estate at all hours, fussing over Julian's ceremonial robes, while barely glancing at the plain pale set laid out for Wesley, exactly as the original memories had warned him they would. He let it happen without complaint. He had bread rising every morning at 4, regardless of what the nobility of the capital thought mattered, and there was a strange, steadying comfort in that. In knowing that no matter how loudly this world insisted, his brother's bonding was the only thing worth caring about that season. His own life had already quietly become something else entirely, something none of them had noticed yet. The bonding day arrived close to 10 weeks after Wesley first woke in this body. Close enough to the number the old memories had warned him about that he allowed himself one long breath of relief that morning. He attended. He wore the pale robes expected of an unbonded Omega sibling, stood where he was told to stand, and watched his brother Julian, 20 years old, light brown hair catching the sun, deep blue eyes bright with the kind of confidence that had never once doubted it was standing at the center of every story it walked into, cross the dais between 5 waiting alphas like the outcome had been decided months ago. There was a small ache in Wesley's chest as the ceremony wore on, faint and strange, some leftover echo of the original boy's heartbreak, brushing up against his own numbness to it. He watched the alpha the original Wesley had once loved, a minor lord's son, pleasant enough looking, nothing remarkable, standing among the candidates, and felt only a distant, second-hand sadness, the kind you feel for a stranger's old wound. Julian chose Sebastian Ward, eldest son of the Duke, exactly as the novel had written it. Wesley understood why. Not love, not really, though Julian would never admit that even to himself. Sebastian's family name was the strongest of the 5, and their sense tested compatible enough to make the match look like fate to everyone watching. Not my story anymore, Wesley reminded himself, and meant it. He clapped politely when the bond was sealed, bowed to his brother, and left the reception early to check on a batch of dough proofing back at the shop. He had bread rising. He didn't have time to grieve a man he'd never actually loved. It happened on an ordinary evening, 15 minutes before closing, The kind of evening Wesley would later find almost funny to look back on, because nothing about it had felt important at the time. The bell over the door rang. Wesley looked up from wiping down the glass case, already halfway through his polite, tired, "We're just about to close, but," and stopped. The man who walked in was tall in a way that made the doorway look smaller, broad-shouldered under a plain dark coat that did nothing to hide the fine tailoring underneath. Black hair pushed back from a face handsome, in the sharp way storm clouds are handsome. Wesley's borrowed memories filled in the rest before the man even opened his mouth. Alaric Voss, cousin twice removed to the reigning emperor, a man whose family owned half the mines in the eastern provinces, whose scent ran so strange and dark that omegas across the capital kept their distance on instinct, whispering that he smelled wrong, scorched, bitter, burnt. His manservant had bought pastries here once and liked them enough to mention it. That, as far as either of them yet knew, was the entire reason Alaric Voss stood in the doorway of a small bakery 15 minutes before closing. Then Wesley's nose caught it, and every rational thought in his head simply stopped. Coffee, not the tea and clipped hedges and expensive floral perfume that drifted through every noble parlor in this kingdom. Coffee, dark and warm and bitter and achingly familiar. The smell of every early shift Wesley had ever worked, every quiet pre-dawn hour with a mug going cold by the ovens, every small good thing about a life he'd thought he'd lost for good. He'd gone 10 weeks in this body without it, telling himself he didn't miss it, and here it was anyway, wrapped around a total stranger like it had followed him across 2 lives just to find him again. His whole body reacted before his mind caught up. He felt his own faint, easily overlooked scent, something like warm milk and honey, never once strong enough to turn a single alpha's head in his life, rise up and outward for the first time he could remember. Across the room, Alaric Voss went very, very still. He smelled it too, something soft and warm cutting cleanly through the vanilla and honey haze of a bakery at closing time. An omega scent, gentle where his own was scorched, soothing where his own was strange, fitting against the rough edges of his own like a lid, finally settling on a pot that had been boiling too long without one. Faded, something old and instinctive in him said, before the calm, careful part of his mind could catch up. A destined pair. Alaric felt the pull of it start behind his own ribs, felt his composure fray at the edges for the first time in years, and did the only thing his panicking mind could think to do. "My apologies," he said, "too fast, too rough. I need to go," and fled. Wesley stood alone in his shop, heart hammering, holding a half-wiped rag, staring at a door that had just swung shut behind the most handsome man he had ever, in either of his lives, laid eyes on. He lifted his own wrist to his nose, half panicked. "Do I smell bad? Did I do something wrong?" He smelled, as far as he could tell, exactly like himself. Warm milk, a little honey, nothing that should send a grown alpha bolting out the door like it was on fire. He thought about that coffee smell all night, the way you think about a song you used to love that you haven't heard in years. He thought about the man's eyes going wide and dark before he ran. And some small, hopeful, entirely new part of him, a part that had nothing to do with the original Wesley's old heartbreak at all, thought, with real regret, he's exactly the kind of trouble I would have liked in my old life too. And I scared him off. He came back the next evening, 15 minutes before closing, precisely, as if he'd spent the whole day outside working up the nerve and simply couldn't manage it any sooner. He bought whatever was left in the case without seeming to look at it, paid in silver he clearly didn't bother to count, and was gone again before Wesley could do more than blink at him. It happened again the evening after that, and the evening after that. Wesley told himself he was only curious. He was not the kind of person who fell fast in either life, and he was certainly not going to start now over a man who ran out the door every time their eyes met for longer than a second. But by the 4th day he'd started, despite himself, watching the door as closing time crept closer. By the 6th, he'd caught himself setting aside one of the good cream puffs, the ones from a batch that had actually come out right, instead of selling it, just in case. He didn't let himself think too hard about what just in case meant. Miles noticed before anyone else did. He'd taken to lingering near closing time himself, chatting about nothing much, while Wesley wiped down counters, and he watched the pattern with the sharp, easy amusement of someone who hadn't yet realized how much it would come to bother him. "You light up when the door goes," Miles said one evening, not quite joking. "Like a whole different person. I don't think I've ever made you light up like that just by walking in. You make me laugh, Wesley said honestly. That's different, is it? Miles said, and though his tone stayed light, something in his eyes did not. He let it go quickly, the way he let most things go, with a grin and a joke about needing more honey twists. But the small thing had already planted itself, quiet and unnoticed, in a corner of his chest that would keep growing whether he wanted it to or not. On the seventh evening, when the bell rang and that same broad shape filled the doorway, already reaching for his coin purse, with his eyes fixed somewhere over Wesley's left shoulder, Wesley set down the rag, planted both hands on the counter, and said, "Wait!" Alaric froze mid-step like a man caught in a trap. "You keep running," Wesley said, gentler than he meant to. Every single time, he hesitated then, because he'd never been good at holding back a real question once it had formed, asked it plainly. "Do I smell unpleasant to you? Is that why you leave so fast?" For a long moment, the great and terrible Alaric Voss, the man mining foreman twice his age, went pale in front of, the man the imperial court gave a wide and careful berth, said absolutely nothing at all. His jaw worked, his ears, Wesley noticed with something like delighted disbelief, had gone faintly red. "No," he finally managed, voice rough. "You smell." He stopped, started again, looking anywhere but Wesley's face. "You smell like the best thing I have ever encountered in my life, and it is deeply inconvenient, because I do not know how to be near you without embarrassing myself, and I would rather leave with my dignity mostly intact than stand here and stammer like an untrained pup in front of the only Omega whose scent has ever made my knees genuinely unsteady." He said all of it very fast and very stiffly, like a man reciting a confession he'd rehearsed in front of a mirror and still couldn't quite deliver smoothly. Wesley stared at him, and then, helplessly, started to laugh. Not unkindly, just startled and warm, because the fearsome Lord Voss, cousin to emperors, master of half the eastern mines, had just admitted to being flustered by a pastry cook in a flour-dusted apron. "You could have just said that," Wesley said, still laughing, "instead of running off with my honey rolls 7 nights running." "I am aware," Alaric said darkly, "that it was not my finest strategy." "Sit," Wesley told him, nodding toward the small table by the window he kept for the rare customer who wanted to linger. "Let me pour you something proper, and you can tell me why an emperor's cousin is scared of a bakery." Something in Alaric's shoulders loosened, slow and visible, like a man setting down a weight he hadn't realized had gotten so heavy. He sat. Wesley went to the counter, and after a moment's hesitation, reached past the tea tin, past the jars of jam, to the small locked box in the back where he kept the last of his coffee beans. Bought a handful at a time off a southern trader who came through twice a season, more expensive than they had any right to be, kept only for himself on the hardest, most homesick nights. He had never once poured them for a customer. He wasn't entirely sure why he was pouring them now, except that some part of him already suspected this particular customer was worth the trade. "I don't usually serve this," he admitted, setting the pot to steep. "It's not on the menu. It's not on anyone's menu in this whole kingdom, as far as I know. But you already smell like it somehow, so I don't imagine it'll surprise you much." Alaric watched him with a strange, careful stillness. "I have never had it before in my life. Then this is a first for both of us," Wesley said, and poured. That was how it started. Not with fireworks, with one secret pot of bitter coffee, and a man who forgot how to be frightening the moment he was handed a warm cup by someone whose scent made his usual iron control dissolve like sugar in hot water. But it didn't rush forward from there. If anything, the weeks that followed moved slower, not faster, as though both of them understood without saying it that whatever this was deserved more care than speed. Alaric came back 3 evenings a week, then 4, always 15 minutes before closing, as if he still couldn't quite let go of the excuse that had brought him there in the first place. He never stayed long enough to make Wesley uncomfortable, and he never left without saying something so painfully honest and stiffly delivered that Wesley had to bite the inside of his cheek to keep from laughing outright. Slowly, the space between them shrank in small, careful steps, a hand brushing another while passing a cup. A shared plate of cream puffs split down the middle, with neither of them mentioning that they'd started sitting closer than the table really required. One quiet evening, when a sudden spring storm kept Alaric from leaving on time, they sat together by the window and watched the rain, shoulders almost touching, saying very little and needing to say even less. It was on that rainy evening that Alaric, without quite seeming to decide to, reached over and tucked a loose strand of dark blonde hair behind Wesley's ear, his fingers lingering a moment longer than the small task required. "Sorry," he said immediately, pulling his hand back like it had touched a hot pan. "That was forward of me." "It was," Wesley agreed and did not lean away. "You can be forward again sometime, if you ask first." Alaric's ears went red all over again, and Wesley decided that was, without question, his new favorite thing in the world to cause. He learned, over those slow weeks, that Alaric had grown up mostly among mining foremen and account books rather than court tutors, that he'd inherited the family's holdings young after a fever took both his parents within the same season, and that he'd built his careful, guarded manner out of pure necessity, from having no one left to lean on, and every reason to distrust anyone who suddenly wanted to get close to a wealthy, well-connected young lord. He learned that Alaric's steward, a thin, harried man named Owen, had nearly quit twice in the past year from the stress of rearranging his employer's schedule around bakery hours, and had once confided to Wesley, half despairing and half delighted, that he had never seen his master this happy in a decade of service. And also, for all his fearsome reputation, Alaric was hopeless the moment Wesley was in the room. He knocked over a display of little cakes in his second week of visits, lunging to catch a falling tray, and instead sending an entire rack scattering across the floor, then apologized so much and rebuilt the display so carefully, sorting pastries that had no order to sort by, that Wesley had to excuse himself to the back room just to laugh until his eyes watered. He once showed up with an enormous, deeply impractical bundle of hedge roses, because a merchant had told him Omegas liked flowers, seeming not to notice or care that Wesley's tiny room above the shop had nowhere at all to put them. He spent 10 straight minutes trying to solve the problem, finally settling the roses into an empty flower barrel with the seriousness of a man solving a genuine engineering puzzle. Wesley's chest ached with something warm and unfamiliar, watching him do it. But for every soft, easy evening, there was a quieter, more careful one too. About 2 months into the visits, Wesley realized with a small jolt of fear that he'd started arranging his whole day around a man who still, some evenings, looked at him like he was trying to solve a puzzle he was afraid of getting wrong. He pulled back, just slightly, for almost a week. Fewer smiles held a beat too long, fewer cream puffs set aside without being asked. Alaric noticed immediately. He didn't push. He simply came the same 3 evenings, sat in the same seat, and on the 3rd evening of Wesley's quiet retreat, said very carefully, "Have I done something to trouble you?" Wesley set down the coffee pot. "No," he admitted. "I think I'm doing something to trouble myself." "Explain it to me," Alaric said. "I am better with plain speech than most people expect," so Wesley did. He told him, haltingly, that he was afraid this whole strange, sudden pull between them was only pheromones talking, some trick of fate deciding for them what their hearts hadn't earned yet on their own, that he wanted, more than anything, to be chosen for himself, and not simply for the scent his body happened to make. Alaric was quiet for a long moment. "Then let us set the scent aside," he said finally. "I will keep coming, and you will keep serving me your coffee, and we will simply see, slowly, without hurrying it, whether I am someone you would have chosen anyway. I am, admittedly, not very good at slow things. My whole life has been mines and ledgers and moving quickly before someone else moves first, but I would like to try if you'll let me." It was, Wesley thought, watching him say it with that same stiff, careful honesty, the least romantic and most romantic thing anyone had ever said to him in either of his lives. "All right," Wesley said, and meant it. Slowly then, they kept the promise better than either of them expected to. Alaric started arriving earlier some evenings, not to press for anything, but simply to sit at the counter and watch Wesley work, asking careful, genuine questions about proofing times and oven temperatures that had nothing to do with courting an Omega and everything to do with wanting to understand the shape of Wesley's actual life, not just the version of it that smelled good to him. He learned, without ever being told directly, that Wesley flinched slightly at loud, sudden noises near the ovens, a habit left over from a life Alaric knew nothing about, and without comment simply began knocking twice on the doorframe before he came all the way inside, so Wesley would never again be startled by someone appearing silently at his shoulder. For his part, Wesley started noticing the smaller, quieter tells beneath Alaric's famous composure, the way his shoulders crept up toward his ears whenever a customer recognized his family crest, and grew suddenly, uncomfortably deferential, the way he answered every question about the mines with brisk, practiced confidence, and every question about himself with careful, guarded half-sentences that trailed off before they finished. One evening, watching him do it again, Wesley set a fresh cup down and said gently, "You don't have to perform being fine with me. I already like you better when you're not." Alaric had gone very quiet at that, turning the cup slowly between his hands before he finally said, "No one has ever put it to me quite so plainly before." Then, after a moment, in a voice rougher than usual, he told Wesley about the fever season properly for the first time, not the tidy, rehearsed version he gave to court, but the real one, the 14-year-old boy standing alone at 2 funerals in the same week, while relatives who had never visited once suddenly began circling his inheritance like gulls. Wesley didn't offer sympathy he hadn't earned the right to give. He simply listened and refilled the cup when it went empty, and let the silence between them do the rest of the work that words couldn't. It was, in its own quiet way, its own kind of falling in love, not the dramatic, faded kind the old memories had warned him to be wary of, but the slower, sturdier kind built one honest evening at a time, the kind Wesley trusted far more. The trouble, when it came from more than one direction at once. 6 months into the shop's success, with a second glass case added and 3 more hired hands kneading dough before dawn, Wesley's father finally stopped smirking. The summons came formally, by messenger, as if Wesley were a business partner rather than a son, an invitation to dine at the family estate, written in his mother's careful hand, though Wesley suspected entirely his father's idea. "The shop has done rather well," his father said, without any greeting, once the soup was cleared. "It occurs to me that the Ashgrove name could do a great deal for its reputation, and that the shop, in turn, could do a great deal for the family's finances, which have grown somewhat strained of late." A careful pause, the way a merchant leaves room for haggling. "I've had papers drawn revising the terms of your original agreement." Wesley set down his fork. "You signed papers 6 months ago," he said, calm as still water, "stating plainly that the family has no claim to my business, and that any profit belongs to me alone. You read them, you signed them. You laughed while you did it, if I recall, because you thought I'd fail within the season." His father's jaw tightened. "Circumstances have changed." "Mine haven't." Wesley looked around the table, his mother's carefully blank face, his father's reddening one, his older brother Julian watching with an expression that had curdled these past months into something closer to resentment, ever since word spread that his little brother's once-forgotten bakery had become the most talked-about place in the capital. His younger brother Nathaniel, 14, quietly clever, was the only one watching Wesley with open admiration instead. "I built that shop with my own 2 hands, my aunt's investment, and a contract you signed of your own free will," Wesley went on, voice level. "I will not renegotiate it because it turned out more successful than you expected a weak, easily overlooked son to manage." Julian broke the silence that followed, his voice sharp and brittle in a way Wesley had never once heard from the beloved eldest child of the family. "You've certainly gotten bold, little brother. Strange how quickly a bit of coin and an emperor's cousin sniffing around your bakery can change a person." "Careful," Wesley said mildly. "You're starting to sound jealous, Julian. It doesn't suit the face everyone's so fond of." His brother's mouth snapped shut, 2 spots of color rising high on his cheeks, the first time in either of Wesley's lives that Julian Ashgrove had been left with nothing pretty to say. Wesley finished his supper, thanked his mother with perfect, unbothered courtesy, and rose to leave. Nathaniel caught up with him in the courtyard as the carriage was being brought round, hovering the way younger brothers do when they have something to say and no good way to start saying it. "You really won't give him any of it," Nathaniel said, half a question. "Even a little." "Not a coin," Wesley said. "Not because I'm cruel, Nathaniel. Because the moment I let him have a little, he'll decide he's owed the rest, and I'll spend the next 10 years fighting the same argument over and over instead of building anything new." He studied his younger brother's face, the same quiet, watchful look he remembered from the borrowed memories, a boy who noticed everything and was rarely asked his opinion about any of it. "You could do the same, you know, whatever you end up wanting to build. Nobody has to hand you permission for it." Nathaniel didn't answer right away. But he was still turning the words over, Wesley could tell, long after the carriage pulled away. And it would be 2 more years before Wesley learned that his younger brother had gone quietly, stubbornly, and entirely on his own initiative to enroll in the capital's trade law college, informing their father of the decision only after the tuition was already paid in full from his own modest savings. Wesley liked to think, though he never said so out loud, that the conversation in that courtyard had planted at least a little of the seed. He left the estate that evening with his contract exactly as it had always been. The nobles were, if anything, worse than his own family, if only because they had no blood tie to soften their cruelty. It happened at a spring garden party thrown by a countess who liked to collect interesting rumors the way other women collected jewelry. "I hear," said one young noblewoman, Fan hiding a smile that was not kind at all, "that Lord Voss has been spending his evenings at some little shop run by a shopkeeper's boy. How very charming for you to have caught the attention of a man so far above your station." A ripple of soft laughter moved through the small circle around her. "I run a bakery," Wesley said pleasantly, "not a shop that runs itself, which I understand is a distinction some of you may not have had the chance to learn firsthand. As for Lord Voss's evenings, I couldn't say what draws his busy man back to the same table 3 nights a week, except that the coffee is very good, and I've never once had to bribe or beg a customer to return for it." Someone near the back of the circle laughed for real that time, quickly disguised as a cough. Wesley turned and found, unexpectedly, that it was Miles, who'd somehow talked his way into an invitation he had no real business having, standing near the refreshment table with an expression of pure delighted pride. "That's my baker," Miles told the group cheerfully, raising his glass as though he'd personally trained Wesley for exactly this moment. It made the noblewoman's smile falter properly, and it made something in Wesley's chest warm with the easy, uncomplicated gratitude you feel for a good friend defending you. He didn't notice the way Miles's own smile faded, just slightly, the moment Alaric appeared at the garden's edge, a few minutes later, arms crossed, watching with the flat, dangerous stillness of a man deciding whether a fight was worth starting. "I was 2 seconds from ending her family's trade contracts," Alaric said, low and rough, falling into step beside Wesley as they crossed the lawn. "I know," Wesley said, and slipped his hand into Alaric's, quiet and easy, the first time he'd done so in public without being asked. "That's exactly why I handled it myself, but thank you for standing close enough to do it if I'd needed you." Alaric's fingers tightened around his, ears going faintly red the way they always did when Wesley caught him off guard with something soft. "You are the most infuriating, capable person I have ever met." Behind them, still by the refreshment table, Miles watched the two of them walk away together, hand in hand, and finally let his easy, practiced smile drop for just a moment. It was a small thing over quickly, replaced almost at once with a grin for the next person who greeted him. But it was the moment he finally admitted to himself what he'd been quietly ignoring for months. He was in love with his baker, and his baker had never once thought of him that way at all. He didn't say anything for a long while after that. He kept coming to the shop, kept his jokes light and his visits easy, because he couldn't stand the thought of losing the friendship even if he couldn't have the rest of it. But there came an evening a few weeks later, closer to autumn, when Wesley found him sitting quietly at the window table, long after his usual joking had run dry, turning an empty teacup in slow circles. "You've been quiet," Wesley said, setting a plate of honey twists down between them, an old habit from their easy days. "That's not like you." Miles looked up and for once didn't reach for a joke to hide behind. "Can I tell you something, and you promise not to make it strange between us afterward?" Wesley's stomach dropped, some instinct already guessing what was coming. "Miles." "I like you," Miles said quickly, like he needed to get it out before his nerve failed him completely. "Not the way I like honey twists. I've liked you since about the 3rd week you opened this shop, if I'm honest, long before the Emperor's cousin ever walked through that door smelling like trouble. I never said anything because you were happy, and I liked being your friend more than I disliked keeping quiet. But I'm tired of watching you look at someone else the way I've wanted you to look at me, and I thought you deserved to know, even if nothing comes of it. Especially if nothing comes of it." Wesley set down the tray he was holding, his chest aching in a way that had nothing to do with romance, and everything to do with the plain, painful honesty of watching a good friend hurt. "Miles," he said gently, I love you, I do. You were my first real friend in this whole strange life, and that matters more to me than I think I've ever told you. But I love you like Ben, like Sadie, like family I got to choose for myself. Not the other way. I'm sorry. I never meant to make you feel like you were waiting for something that was never going to come. Miles let out a breath that shook only a little and managed a smile that was smaller than his usual grin, but real all the same. I know. I think I've known for a while, if I'm being fair to myself. I just needed to say it once, out loud, so it would stop living quietly in my chest and start being something I could actually put down. He paused. Are we all right? We will be, Miles said, before Wesley could even answer, and reached for a honey twist with something like his old ease returning to his shoulders. Give me a little time to be sad about it properly, and then I fully intend to keep eating your pastries and being insufferable at your expense, because losing my chances with you is bad enough without losing free bread too. Wesley laughed, wet-eyed and grateful, and reached across the table to squeeze his hand once, the way he might for any friend who had just been brave. It was not the ending either of them would have written for Miles. Not the one his own heart had quietly hoped for, but it was an honest one, and Wesley thought, watching him slowly find his smile again, that honest endings mattered too, even the ones that ached. The shop's fame, once it started climbing, did not slow down. By the end of the first year, Hearth and Honey had outgrown its modest storefront twice over, expanding into the building next door, with a proper little room set aside, where Wesley finally carefully began serving coffee to the wider public, one curious noble at a time, letting them discover the strange, bitter southern drink for themselves rather than pushing it on anyone. Within a season, half the capital's fashionable young lords were requesting it by name and paying absurd prices for the privilege. Commoners still came for the jam buns and honey twists, kept deliberately affordable, because Wesley had never once forgotten what it felt like to want something sweet and simple and just slightly out of reach. Word traveled the trade routes, the way flour dust traveled through a kitchen, quiet and persistent, settling everywhere. By the second year, a second Hearth and Honey opened in the southern trading city, where his grandmother lived. Run by a manager, Wesley had trained himself over 3 long months of letters, and eventually a personal visit to walk the woman through every recipe by hand. His grandmother had cried openly at the opening, refusing to admit it was the coffee counter that moved her rather than any particular pride in her grandson, though everyone in earshot suspected otherwise. Letters arrived weekly after that, boasting to anyone who would listen about her grandson's shop being the talk of 2 kingdoms at once, each one signed with a little postscript demanding to know when he intended to visit again and bring that dreadfully serious young lord with him, because she had heard quite enough about Alaric Voss secondhand and intended to form her own opinion of him directly. His parents, for their part, learned to be quietly, carefully proud of him in public, not out of any real change of heart, Wesley suspected, but because it had grown socially costly not to be. Julian's jealousy cooled eventually into something closer to wary respect, especially once it became clear Wesley had no interest at all in taking back any spotlight that had once been his brother's. He simply wanted his own, and had built it himself, coin by coin, loaf by loaf. Miles, true to his word, kept showing up 3 times a week, louder and funnier than ever, and somewhere along the way his friendship stopped aching and simply became what it always should have been, easy and real and entirely its own kind of steady. And through all of it, every evening Alaric Voss came to the shop with far less pretense now, and far more ease. He'd long since stopped needing an excuse. He kept a coat hook by the back table that had, without either of them quite deciding it, simply become his. Their first kiss happened on an unremarkable Tuesday, of all things, with flour still dusting Wesley's hands and the shop closed for the night. Alaric had been telling him very seriously about a dispute between 2 of his mine foremen when he stopped mid-sentence, looking at Wesley across the small table with an expression that had gone suddenly, helplessly soft. "What?" Wesley asked, a smudge of flour on his cheek. "Nothing," Alaric said, "only that I have wanted to kiss you for the better part of a year, and I find I am done waiting for a more romantic moment to arrive." "This is hardly romantic," Wesley said, laughing. "I smell like yeast." "You smell," Alaric said, already leaning across the table, "like the only home I have ever chosen for myself." The kiss, when it came, was soft and heard tastings faintly of coffee and honey, and it left both of them a little breathless and a little dazed, foreheads resting together afterward while the ovens ticked as they cooled behind them. It was not their last kiss, not by a wide margin, but Wesley would remember that first one, flower-dusted and unplanned, for the rest of both his lives. It was on a quiet evening, 2 years to the day, after a coffee-scented stranger first fled through that front door in a panic, that Alaric set down his cup and reached for Wesley's hand across the small table, instead of asking for anything at all. "I have been thinking," he said, slower than usual, "about how long 2 years feels, and how short it also feels, and I find I no longer wish to measure my life by how many evenings I have left before I finally say this properly." He paused. His hand, Wesley noticed with quiet delight, was shaking just slightly. "I love you." Not because of any scent, not because fate decided it for us, before either of us had a say. I have watched you long enough now to know it would be true, even if I had never smelled a single thing that first evening. I love the way you argue with countesses in gardens, and the way you sort dough at 4 in the morning, and the way you have never once in 2 years let me win an argument just because I'm supposed to be frightening. Wesley's eyes had gone unexpectedly wet. "Alaric, let me finish," Alaric said with the same stubborn steadiness he brought to everything. "I am not good at fast things, and I do not think I ever will be, but I am asking you now, slowly and properly, after 2 years of earning the right to ask it, whether you would consider being my bonded mate." "You already know I will," Wesley told him, laughing a little wet-eyed, reaching across the small table to still those shaking hands with his own flower-dusted ones. "You've been leaving that coat on my hook for a year. I think we bonded ourselves a long time before you worked up the nerve to ask properly." "I like to do things properly," Alaric said. And Wesley watched the fiercest, most feared man in the empire go soft and red-eared and entirely undone, right there at a small table by the window of the once overlooked shop that had, against every plan the story had ever laid out for him, become entirely, unmistakably his own. The bonding ceremony was small, smaller than his brother's had been by design, held in the courtyard behind the shop rather than some grand hall, strung with paper lanterns and smelling of warm sugar and roasting coffee instead of hedges and old blood. His aunt cried through the entire thing and denied it fiercely afterward. His younger brother Nathaniel, 17 now, and studying trade law with quiet ambition, gave a toast that made the whole courtyard laugh. Even his parents came, and even managed, for one evening, to look at their second son like they were glad, rather than merely relieved, that he existed. Julian came too, and offered, stiffly but sincerely, a short toast of his own, one that ended with something close to real warmth in his voice, the first honest thing Wesley had heard from him in either of his lives. Miles stood near the front, grinning wide and unguarded, and when it came time for him to speak, he raised his glass and said, "I've known this man since his shop was 3 tables and a dream, and I've loved him exactly as long, in exactly the way that turned out to matter most, as the truest friend I have ever had. Alaric, if you make him unhappy, I know for a fact he can outrun you on a bad hip, so I wouldn't risk it." The courtyard roared with laughter, and Wesley, watching Miles laugh along with them, easy and whole and genuinely happy, felt his own chest fill with something warm and grateful and entirely without ache. Ben and Sadie stood near the back with the rest of the shop's growing staff, all of them a little teary and a little proud because they had watched this life get built one tray at a time, right alongside him. Wesley stood in the courtyard of the shop he had built from 386 gold coins and a stubborn heart, holding the hand of a man who still, after everything, went a little pink-eared whenever Wesley's scent caught him off guard, and thought about a boy who had woken up 18 years old and 10 weeks from ruin, certain the only stories worth living were the ones written for someone else. "I told you," he thought, to whatever quiet, faded piece of the original Wesley still lingered somewhere beneath his own borrowed heartbeat. "We were never meant to be an afterthought. We just had to write the rest of it ourselves." Somewhere in the crowd, his old co-worker Priya's voice echoed absurdly in his memory. "You have to read this. There's literally a character with your name." And Wesley laughed out loud at the strangeness of it all, at a life that had ended in fire and begun again in flour and sugar and the smell of good coffee, at a story that had never once, in any version of it, really been about who was loved best. It had only ever been about who dared, finally, to make a life worth living.